Hey, I wanted to jump on. We are going to start this series on the purchase agreement. And so what we're going to do is I do want you to have .loop pulled up. I want you to have a buyer loop created and go ahead and enter into the purchase agreement. So this is going to be divided up by page. So this section is for page 1 of the DMAAR purchase agreement. So please, guys, when you're using .loop and you're opening up documents for the first time, it is in your best interest to go ahead and use the autofill because once that information is in and collected, then it will help populate forms moving forward. So the purchase agreement really is a chance to start off with the, let me shrink that screen down a little bit more, but a chance to start off and just be mindful. We need a date, right? The top of it, the date, the MLS number of the property. And then just there's a reminder that there's an agency agreement so that this purchase agreement goes with the agency agreement that they've already signed. 2 is the sellers from the buyers. How are they taking title? So I encourage you to go to the assessor's page to look and see how the seller actually holds title. And then in your buyer consults, be asking buyers, what's your legal name? How do you plan to take title? It's much easier if we put it in correctly the first time versus trying to make some accommodations later. The .loop system doesn't really like to have changes in it. So once we have that, line 12 starts off with the buyer's offer to buy the real property situated in what county is it in, what city is it in, and then locally known as, so that would be the address. And I really prefer just to have the assessor's page open and kind of do copy and pasting of that. And then the legal description. So once you've got that information done, you then will decide how are you paying for this property. So are you taking out a new mortgage? Is there going to be an assumption or contract for deed, which in 27 years I've never done, not saying that you couldn't, or is it cash? So A, B, and C. Pick one of those. I actually wish this were written a little bit different, but until I get on the forms committee, I guess I just need to follow along what they have done. So if there is a new mortgage, if you have my encouragement is that everybody has a pre-approval before you write an offer, or that is my policy when I work with buyers, is that I want them to have that conversation and have a pre-approval in hand so that I understand, one, the purchase power that they're going to be implementing, and also really just so I know how to write the contract the best. So if I'm going to take out a new mortgage, then I need to say what kind of mortgage is it. So is it conventional, FHA, VA, is it USDA, is it NFC, what is it? For not more than what percentage is the mortgage for. So this can confuse some people sometimes. So if they're putting 20% down, the answer for this blank would be 80% is what the amount that they're financing. So then what interest rate are they getting? Now there's some room for some lessons here. So in best practices, it is encouraged that you put an actual interest rate in here. Okay, let me tell you why. It is very common for people to use terms like best. And that can be fine. I know a lot of people that use that in their practice, unless we have a situation where interest rates might go up pretty quickly. Now, if your buyer client still qualifies for that mortgage, but maybe let's say for an example, like in the spring of 23, when interest rates jumped a lot very quickly, if you put best interest rate in here for your buyer, and then the interest rates jump a lot, but they still qualify, there's no out under financing terms. So what you want to do, in my opinion, and in best practices, is put an amount in here that caps it at some point. Because if interest rates would change a lot, then your buyer is protected and your buyer gets to make the decision on whether or not they choose to move forward under the new, changes to the interest rate that have been experienced. Now, let's say their interest rate comes in at 6.875. And you're like, are you okay up to 7? You can put a little bit of a buffer in there, but it does tremendously pain me when I see people just put best, because to me, that's not the best thing for the buyer. Okay. And then what term? Is it 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years? What is that? The section comes down line 31, starts to talk about the buyers will provide to the sellers a written preliminary approval within blank days from acceptance. This preliminary approval must show the buyer has the ability to qualify for the loan and the terms. Now, I actually prefer, right, to have the buyers have a pre-qual. So that kind of takes care of that for this situation. But most commonly, I see maybe 5 days. I've seen some people put 1 day in here, but you better have a pretty good relationship with your lender and know that they can collect information and get that back to you within a day. So typically I see about a 5-day in there. The preliminary approval must show that they qualify, and then written final loan commitment shall follow with all lender contingencies met, including appraisal, if required on or about blank days prior to closing. So this can really fluctuate. Some people will put 5 days in here. Some people will put 10 days in here. So either one of those is acceptable. One thought is that if you're selling a new construction home that isn't finished, and sometimes the appraiser will come, but will need to come back at the end when everything is wrapped up. And so if that would need to happen, then it might shrink that time frame that would be available to have that full loan commitment. Now, on a side note, the lenders that I've asked have said they don't really pay a whole lot of attention to those dates. But again, somewhere in that first space on line 31, about 5 days, and then within 5 to 10 days prior to closing on the second space there. All right, we come down to lines 41 and 42. So this talks about, is the buyer paying their closing costs, or is the seller going to contribute to their closing costs? So one of those needs to be checked. So if the buyer is just planning on paying their loan costs, then check line 41. If they're going to be asking the seller to contribute, then you would check the box on line 42, and in the space, put the amount that it cannot exceed. Okay, so that is what would go into those spaces. If you're doing an assumption or a contract for deed, you would check 44. Now here's some things. I'm hearing this come up again recently. I heard last weekend that a seller was wanting to offer an assumption, and I'm like, there are parameters around that. It's not as easy as it seems. So you have to contact the lender of which the seller has that loan. It typically can only be for the loan amount of the balance, and so the buyer has to come to the table with all the extra funds in cash, which just not everybody has that option. And so contract for deed, you're just buying it on contract. So if it's one of those, go ahead and check box 44. If your client is using cash, so that's line 45, the checkbox there, if they're paying cash for the property, then what I do, if I have a buyer consult and they tell me that they're paying cash, I like to go ahead and collect just a proof of funds from wherever that cash is coming from. And so if it's cash and it's sitting in an account that they have with their bank, they can print off a statement. I do cross out the account numbers on that, or have them cross that out. But I like to just kind of have that handy so that when we're ready to write our offer, we have that proof of funds. Now, it does say that the seller has the right to request and receive verification of funds within 5 days of the acceptance. Okay, if I'm a seller and I'm considering a cash option, I want to know that they have the money at that time. So go ahead and collect that up front if you can for that. The other conversation piece I'll note around this is that if they're telling me that they have cash, but it's in like an investment account, I always ask them, how much time do you need to get the funds? Because I've seen it happen before where they're like, yep, I'm getting it from my 401k. And then they go a week before and it takes 2 weeks to get the funds distributed. So please just, that's a conversation I just prep them for, is that have you checked to see what time frame is needed in order for you to be able to get that money. So line 49 talks about appraisal. Please, I forget this because I feel like the appraisal section should be its own section, but again, I'm not on forms committee. So if it's cash, right, typically the benefit of a cash offer is that there is no appraisal required. Now, could a cash buyer ask for an appraisal? They sure can. but then it kind of doesn't make the cash offer as much of an incentive, right? The other thing with the appraisal is that if there's a loan, right, the lenders dictate the appraisal. So if they're getting any kind of loan, definitely make sure that you check the box for the appraisal. All right, guys, that finishes up page 1 of the purchase agreement. Your sellers will need to initial at the bottom of each page and anywhere else that it's indicated. And so we'll finish up page 1 and we'll move on to page 2 next.